In the sweltering heat of a Georgia plantation in 1842, a young white woman stood at an altar holding the hand of a man her father had purchased. She was 16 years old. He was property. And what happened next would create 67 human beings born into a nightmare that defied every moral boundary of even that savage era. This isn't a story about the institution of slavery as you learned it in textbooks. This is something far more calculated, far more sinister, and deliberately hidden from history's pages. What her father orchestrated wasn't just enslavement, it was industrial-scale human breeding masked as marriage, sanctioned by perverted religious ceremony, and protected by laws designed to ensure that children born from these unions would multiply his wealth exponentially. The screams that echoed from those quarters weren't just the sounds of labor in cotton fields. They were the sounds of systematic rape, forced reproduction, and generation after generation of human beings bred like livestock while the world looked away. This was eugenics before the word existed, capitalism at its most monstrous, and a family secret that would take 180 years to fully uncover. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of Southern respectability? Then subscribe right now, comment your location below to join this investigation, and prepare yourself, because once you hear this story, you'll never look at antebellum Georgia the same way again. I want you to picture this. Georgia, 1842. The air hangs thick and wet, so humid that breathing feels like drowning on dry land. Willow County, a fictional name for a very real place, sits nestled in the fertile crescent of Middle Georgia, where cotton grows tall and white gold makes men into gods. The dirt roads wind between sprawling plantations, each one a self-contained kingdom, where a single white man holds the power of life and death over hundreds of human souls. Church bells ring every Sunday morning, calling the faithful to whitewashed Baptist churches, where preachers in starched collars speak of Christian duty and biblical servitude. The smell of magnolia blossoms mixes with the acrid stench of sweat, blood, and suffering that permeates every inch of Southern soil. In town, merchants and lawyers and doctors smile and shake hands, their fortunes built entirely on the broken backs of people they refuse to recognize as human. The legal system, the religious establishment, the medical community, the business elite, all of them intertwined in a conspiracy of silence that protected the most profitable crime in American history. This was a world where a man could do absolutely anything to the people he owned, and the only question anyone would ask was whether it increased his profit margin. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't considered evil in 1842 Georgia. This was considered good business. His name was Jeremiah Coulson, and if you had met him at a church social or seen him riding through town in his fine carriage, you would have thought him the very model of Southern gentility. 47 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and a smile that made people trust him instantly. He owned 340 acres of prime cotton land, held positions on 3 civic boards, and never missed Sunday service. His neighbors called him Colonel, though he'd never served a day in the military. It was simply a title of respect afforded to wealthy landowners. He had a particular way of speaking, soft and measured, with carefully chosen words that made even his most monstrous proposals sound reasonable, even righteous. His wife, Eleanor, had died 5 years earlier in childbirth, taking their only son with her. That tragedy, people said, had changed him, made him withdrawn, obsessed with legacy, desperate to build something that would outlast him. But here's what those same sympathetic neighbors didn't know or chose not to see. Jeremiah Coulson wasn't mourning, he was planning. In the privacy of his study, by candlelight, he filled leather-bound journals with calculations, projections, and breeding charts that would have made a livestock trader blush. He studied bloodlines, tracked hereditary traits, and developed theories about genetic optimization that predated Mendel's pea plant experiments by 2 decades. And he had a daughter, 16-year-old Sarah, who he viewed not as his child, but as the linchpin of the most profitable, most diabolical enterprise ever conceived on American soil. Let's be real, what Coulson planned was so audacious, so transparently evil, that it required a cover story wrapped in layers of social acceptability and religious justification. So he began speaking, carefully and selectively, about a bold social experiment he'd read about in agricultural journals from Cuba and Brazil. He called it the Coulson method, a system of managed cultivation that would, he claimed, create a more productive and contented enslaved workforce through natural affinity and familial bonds. At church gatherings and Masonic lodge meetings, he'd explain his theory with charts and papers, arguing that enslaved people who were allowed to form stable family units under careful oversight would be less likely to rebel, more invested in their work, and would naturally produce children who were genetically optimized for agricultural labor. He cited biblical passages about stewardship and multiplication. He referenced pseudoscientific theories popular among slave owners about improving stock through selective breeding. Most crucially, he positioned himself as a reformer, a progressive thinker who was actually treating his enslaved people more humanely by allowing them the dignity of marriage and family. Some listeners were skeptical, certainly, but others, plantation owners who saw their own profit margins and sought any method to increase productivity, listened with growing interest. The genius of Coulson's public presentation was that he never explicitly stated what he truly intended. He let people hear what they wanted to hear. A more efficient system of enslavement dressed up in the language of Christian mercy and scientific progress. And in 1842, Georgia, that was more than enough. Now, this is where the story gets truly chilling, because Coulson didn't just have an evil idea. He built the physical infrastructure to implement it on an industrial scale. In the fall of 1841, he began construction on what he called the quarters, but these weren't typical slave cabins. Using money borrowed against future cotton yields, he erected 12 large wooden structures arranged in a precise grid pattern at the far western edge of his property, deliberately positioned out of sight from the main house and the county road. Each structure was divided into 4 separate living spaces, each one approximately 16 feet by 20 feet, large enough for a family unit. But here's what makes your skin crawl. Coulson personally designed the interior layouts to maximize his breeding objectives. Each unit had a main sleeping chamber, a small cooking area, and most disturbingly, a nursery section with multiple cradles built into the walls. The buildings had thick walls and tiny windows positioned high up, ostensibly for cooling, but actually to ensure privacy and muffle sounds. He installed a bell system that could be rung from the main house, summoning specific individuals on command. Behind the residential quarters, he constructed what he termed the medical facility, a sterile white building staffed by a physician from Augusta who asked no questions as long as the money kept flowing. This facility existed for one purpose: monitoring pregnancies, ensuring safe deliveries to maximize infant survival, and tracking genetic outcomes in ledgers that read like livestock breeding records. He even built a separate kitchen and dining hall where meals could be controlled to ensure pregnant women received adequate nutrition, not out of compassion, but to protect his investment. The entire complex was surrounded by a subtle but very real perimeter of cleared land, making it impossible for anyone to approach or leave without being seen. This wasn't a plantation. It was a human breeding facility designed by a man who had thought of everything. You might be wondering, how did this not raise immediate red flags? How did neighbors not question why Coulson was suddenly building what amounted to a small village on his property? Now, you have to understand the psychology of complicity that made this possible. When local merchants delivered lumber and nails for the construction, Coulson explained he was building improved quarters to boost morale and productivity, a practice that, while unusual, aligned with some progressive plantation management theories of the era. When fellow planters visited and noticed the unusual layout, he invited them to tour the facilities, explaining his family cultivation method in such respectable scientific language that most nodded along, impressed by his innovation. The physician he hired, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a man with gambling debts and a medical license from a questionable Caribbean institution, told anyone who asked that he was conducting a longitudinal study on hereditary health outcomes in agricultural populations. The medical terminology was deliberately dense and boring, designed to make people's eyes glaze over and stop asking questions. When enslaved people from neighboring plantations whispered rumors about strange happenings at the Coulson place, white overseers dismissed it as typical slave gossip, exaggeration, or jealousy. And here's the most chilling part. Several neighboring planters expressed interest in implementing similar systems on their own properties. Coulson's careful presentation had actually made industrial-scale human breeding sound not just acceptable, but admirable, the mark of a forward-thinking businessman. The few who felt uneasy, who sensed something deeply wrong, stayed silent. Because in 1842, Georgia, publicly criticizing a wealthy white man's treatment of his property could destroy your social standing, your business relationships, and your family's future. Silence was survival, and Coulson counted on that. Every monster needs enablers, and Jeremiah Coulson found his in Silas Broadmoor, overseer, enforcer, and the man who would actually implement the daily operations of what we can only call Coulson's breeding program. Broadmoor was 32 years old, built like an oak tree, with pale eyes that never showed emotion, and hands that had dealt violence so casually for so long that cruelty had become his native language. He'd worked on 4 plantations before Coulson hired him, fired from 2 of them, not for brutality, which was expected, but for excessive enthusiasm in his punishments, which tells you everything about how depraved he must have been to cross even those lines. Coulson hired him specifically for these qualities, recognizing in Broadmoor a man with no moral boundaries and an eagerness to please authority figures. But Broadmoor brought something else to the operation: organizational genius. He created schedules, tracking systems, and enforcement mechanisms that turned Coulson's theoretical breeding program into horrifying reality. He kept meticulous records of every woman's menstrual cycles, tracked every pregnancy, and noted every birth in ledgers that still exist in historical archives, though their true purpose was deliberately obscured through coded language. Broadmoor also served as the operation's primary intimidation force, making it crystal clear to everyone in the quarters that resistance would be met with immediate savage consequences, not just to the resistor, but to their loved ones. He understood the psychology of captivity better than most people understand their own minds. He knew that the threat of separation, of children being sold away, of parents being punished for children's disobedience, would create a compliance born of desperation, and perhaps most disturbingly, Broadmoor seemed to genuinely believe in Coulson's mission, speaking about the breeding program with an almost religious fervor, as if he were participating in something historically significant rather than historically monstrous. In other documents and testimonies that emerged decades later, survivors would describe Broadmoor not with hatred. Hatred implied emotional engagement, but with hollow-eyed terror, the kind that comes from encountering someone fundamentally lacking in human empathy. Let's talk about the people at the center of this nightmare, because they weren't abstractions. They were human beings with names, histories, and dreams that Coulson sought to erase. Among the enslaved people on Coulson's plantation were men and women who had been born into bondage, purchased at auction, or inherited from his late wife's family holdings. They ranged in age from teenagers to elders in their 50s, representing a diversity of skills: field workers, house servants, blacksmiths, carpenters, seamstresses, cooks. Many had families already, spouses they'd committed to in ceremonies that held no legal recognition but carried immense personal meaning, children they were raising despite the constant terror of sale and separation. What made them particularly vulnerable to Coulson's scheme was precisely these family bonds. He had carefully studied which people loved whom, who had children, who would sacrifice anything to protect their family members. These bonds, which in any moral universe would be sacred, became weapons Coulson wielded with surgical precision. Among them was a man named Samuel, 26 years old, a skilled carpenter whose craftsmanship had built many of the fine details in Coulson's main house. He had a wife, Ruth, and 2 young sons. There was Grace, 19, who worked in the main house and had been taught to read secretly by Coulson's late wife, literacy that she desperately hid. There was Jacob, a field worker known for his quiet dignity, and his way of lifting people's spirits through songs that carried coded messages of resistance and hope. And there were others, dozens of others, each one a complete human being, with interior lives rich with love, ambition, faith, and resilience. Now you have to understand, these were not people lacking in awareness of their own oppression. They knew they were enslaved. They knew the system was evil. But what they couldn't initially understand was that Coulson was about to transform their already unbearable situation into something unprecedented in its calculated cruelty. They couldn't imagine that one of their own, in this case, Coulson's own daughter, would become both victim and instrument of his scheme. His name was Thomas Blackwood, and he was nobody, a traveling Methodist circuit preacher, 34 years old, riding from plantation to plantation, offering religious services to enslaved communities, one of the few white men who actually believed black souls mattered to God. He'd been invited to Coulson's plantation by Silas Broadmoor in early March 1842, before the full implementation of Coulson's program, to conduct a series of evening prayer services in the quarters. Blackwood was grateful for the invitation, seeing it as evidence of Christian charity, never suspecting he was being used as a prop in Coulson's elaborate staging. After all, what kind of evil operation allows a preacher on the premises? But Blackwood was observant in ways Coulson hadn't anticipated. On the third evening of his visit, while walking back to his horse after services, he passed the main house and heard raised voices, unusual in a home that presented such perfect decorum. The window was slightly open to catch the evening breeze. He shouldn't have stopped, he shouldn't have listened, but something in the tone, a young woman's voice, Sarah's voice, sharp with betrayal and horror, made him freeze in the shadows. What he heard in that 5-minute conversation would haunt him until his death, 32 years later. He heard Jeremiah Coulson explaining to his daughter, in calm, measured tones, that she would be married to Samuel the carpenter in 2 weeks' time. When Sarah screamed that she wouldn't, that it was insane, illegal, impossible, Coulson replied in a voice dripping with patriarchal authority that she would do her duty to family legacy, that this was no different than arranged marriages among nobility, that the breeding program required a white maternal line to produce children who would be legally enslaved through her status while carrying genetic traits he deemed valuable. Blackwood had heard Sarah's sobbing, her pleas, and Coulson's cold response, "You will comply, or I will sell every person in the quarters to the cruelest plantations in the Deep South, and their suffering will be on your conscience." Thomas Blackwood stood in those shadows, his entire worldview collapsing. He was a man of faith who believed in redemption, who thought he understood evil, but this was something he had no framework to comprehend. And in that moment, hidden in the darkness, he faced an impossible choice: ride away and preserve his own safety, or try to stop something that would make him a target of one of the most powerful men in the county. Thomas Blackwood didn't sleep that night. He lay in the small room Coulson had provided in the overseer's cottage, staring at ceiling beams and trying to convince himself he'd misunderstood, that he'd somehow misheard, that there was a rational explanation for what sounded like a father forcing his daughter into a breeding arrangement with an enslaved man. By dawn, he'd made his decision. He had to speak to someone in authority, someone who could intervene before this nightmare took shape. He left at first light without breakfast, riding hard to the county seat of Willow Springs, going directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Edmund Cartwright was a portly man of 55 with military service in the Creek Wars, and a reputation for no-nonsense law enforcement. Blackwood, still shaking, explained what he'd overheard, speaking in urgent, tumbling sentences. "Now, let's be real about what happened next." Sheriff Cartwright listened with an expression that shifted from polite attention to skepticism to barely concealed annoyance. When Blackwood finished, Cartwright leaned back in his chair and asked, "You heard this through a window? At night? From how far away?" The interrogation had begun, not of Coulson, but of Blackwood. The sheriff suggested that Blackwood, being a sensitive religious man, had perhaps misinterpreted a conversation about some sort of domestic arrangement. "Colonel Coulson is a respected member of this community," Cartwright said, his tone hardening, "a deacon in the Baptist church, a man who's contributed generously to this county's prosperity, And you're accusing him of what, exactly? There's no law against how a man manages his property. And as for his daughter, she's his daughter. That's family business. When Blackwood protested, insisting that what Coulson planned was beyond any boundary of law or decency, Cartwright's patience evaporated. I'll tell you what I think happened, the sheriff said coldly. I think you spent too much time with slaves, got yourself confused about the natural order of things, and now you're seeing sin where there's just good business. I suggest you move along to your next parish and forget you heard anything. The message was clear. Pursue this, and you'll be the one facing consequences. Blackwood left that office understanding that the power structure would protect one of their own, that justice was a privilege afforded only to those who already had power, and that he was utterly alone in his knowledge of Coulson's plan. But Thomas Blackwood was either braver or more foolish than most men. He couldn't let it go. Over the next week, he traveled to 3 neighboring counties, speaking to magistrates, ministers, and anyone with influence, trying to find someone who would take his concerns seriously. His campaign backfired spectacularly. Within 10 days, a formal complaint was filed against him, not against Coulson, but against Blackwood himself, for spreading malicious falsehoods against a respected citizen. The complaint, signed by 5 prominent planters including 2 of Coulson's business associates, accused Blackwood of attempting to incite slave unrest through inflammatory accusations. The Methodist Regional Authority, embarrassed by the controversy and fearful of losing access to wealthy plantation-owning congregants, quietly suggested Blackwood take a spiritual sabbatical and remove himself from the circuit. The closest thing to an official inquiry came when a county magistrate, under pressure from the formal complaint, visited Coulson's plantation for what was essentially a social call. Coulson, warned in advance, welcomed the magistrate with bourbon and cigars. He gave a tour of the quarters, where everything looked like a model of plantation management, clean, organized, and, to any casual observer, unremarkable. When asked about the circuit preacher's concerns, Coulson laughed, a genuine, warm laugh, and explained that he'd been discussing business matters with his daughter, that she'd been upset about unrelated personal matters, and that poor Reverend Blackwood, who'd been walking past at an unfortunate moment, had apparently constructed an elaborate fiction from fragments of overheard conversation. Honestly, magistrate, Coulson said, with seemingly sincere bewilderment, I can't fathom where he got such wild ideas. The Reverend struck me as somewhat unstable. Perhaps the stress of his circuit work has affected his judgment. The magistrate, who had no interest in discovering anything that would complicate his relationship with a wealthy donor to his political campaigns, filed a report concluding that no evidence of impropriety was found, and that accusations appear to stem from misunderstanding or deliberate fabrication. Case closed. The machinery of plausible deniability had worked exactly as designed, and Jeremiah Coulson was free to proceed with his monstrous plan. I want you to picture this. It's now June 1842, 3 months after Coulson initiated his program, and if you had visited the quarters, you would have noticed something deeply unsettling in the eyes of the people living there. They moved with the mechanical precision of individuals in shock, performing their tasks with a hollow efficiency that comes from psychological disassociation. Grace, the house servant who could secretly read, developed a stammer that made speech difficult, communicating mostly through gestures. Jacob, who'd once led evening songs, stopped singing entirely, his voice apparently stolen by what he'd witnessed. Ruth, Samuel's wife, had been separated from her husband, moved to a different cabin under the pretext of reassignment, and walked through each day as though her soul had vacated her body. The psychological impact was precisely what Coulson had calculated: trauma as a control mechanism. But the most visible evidence was Sarah Coulson herself. The girl who 3 months earlier had been seen in town laughing with friends, shopping for ribbons, and planning attendance at summer social events had been completely transformed. She appeared in public rarely now, and when she did, people whispered about her nervous condition. She'd lost weight, her skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor, and her eyes carried a haunted quality that made even hardened plantation wives uncomfortable. At church, she sat silent and still, no longer participating in the young women's societies, no longer engaging in the social fabric of her class. Her father explained to concerned inquirers that she was struggling with grief over her late mother, a convenient lie that allowed people to sympathize while asking no further questions. Those who saw her knew something was profoundly wrong, but in a society where women's suffering was considered private family business, no one intervened. And then there were the physical signs. By late summer, it became impossible to hide that Sarah was pregnant. Coulson announced to the community that his daughter had been secretly married to a respectable young man from South Carolina, who tragically died in a riding accident before their union could be properly announced. The story was transparent fiction to anyone paying attention, but paying attention required courage that most lacked. The reality, whispered only in the enslaved community and by a few horrified house servants who witnessed the truth, was that Sarah's pregnancy was the first result of her father forcing her into serial sexual encounters with Samuel, a man who was himself a victim, coerced under threat of his family's destruction. This wasn't marriage in any real sense, it was systematized rape, and it was just the beginning. This is where the story reaches depth so calculated, so methodically evil, that even knowing we're discussing historical fact feels surreal. Because Jeremiah Coulson didn't operate on impulse or passion, he operated according to a system he'd designed with the precision of an engineer. Documents that survived in his personal papers, discovered during an estate archive project in the 1960s, reveal the full scope of his methodology. Coulson maintained detailed ledgers recording every aspect of his breeding program: dates of conception, estimated dates of birth, physical characteristics of parents, health outcomes, and projections for future generations. He developed a rotation system where Sarah would be matched with different enslaved men based on traits he deemed valuable: physical strength, intelligence, manual dexterity, even temperament. Each pairing was documented with pseudoscientific annotations about genetic inheritance theories that wouldn't be properly understood for another 50 years. Dr. Whitmore, the complicit physician, conducted regular examinations and provided medical care that ensured maximum reproductive success, not for the well-being of the people involved, but to protect Coulson's investment. The documents reveal that Coulson projected, conservatively, that his program would produce 60 to 70 children over a 20-year period. These children, legally enslaved through their mother's status despite being Coulson's grandchildren, would represent enormous wealth, each one valued at approximately $800 to $1,200 at maturity, meaning the program could generate over $50,000 in human capital, equivalent to over $1.5 million today. But the methodology extended beyond simple breeding. Coulson had developed a complex system for managing the psychological dimensions of his program. He used Sarah's love for the enslaved people as leverage, threatening their torture or sale if she resisted. He used the enslaved men's love for their existing families as leverage, threatening separation or violence against wives and children if they refused to participate in his program. He created a closed loop of coercion where everyone's humanity was weaponized against them. And perhaps most chillingly, his papers reveal his belief that he was conducting groundbreaking research in human cultivation that would eventually be recognized as visionary. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a scientific pioneer. That delusion, that absolute conviction in his own righteousness, allowed him to inflict horrors that even other slave owners of his era would have found shocking. Now, you have to understand, this level of systematization, this industrial approach to human breeding, represents slavery at its most purely evil. Humans reduced to genetic material, reproduction transformed into profit extraction, and suffering engineered with deliberate calculation. Every story this dark needs light, even if that light is small and flickering and constantly threatened with extinction. That light came in the form of an unexpected hero, Clara Whitmore, the 22-year-old daughter of the complicit Dr. Marcus Whitmore, the physician who provided medical cover for Coulson's breeding program. Clara was everything her father wasn't: She possessed a conscience, a fierce intelligence, and a growing horror about what she'd begun to suspect was happening on the Colson plantation. She'd been educated at a Quaker school in Philadelphia, where she'd been exposed to abolitionist ideas that were anathema in Georgia society. She'd returned home in the spring of 1842 reluctantly, only because her mother had fallen ill and needed care. Clara had a natural gift for medicine, having assisted her father since childhood, and possessed the sharp observational skills that made her dangerous to people hiding secrets. She was petite, dark-haired, with intense brown eyes that missed nothing, and a stubborn streak, her father complained, made her unsuitable for proper Southern womanhood. What made Clara different from other people who suspected something wrong at the Colson plantation was that she had access. Her father's medical work gave her reasons to visit the quarters, and her relative youth and femininity made her seem less threatening, allowing her to move through spaces where others would be watched carefully. But Clara carried her own burden of complicity. She knew her father was involved in something deeply wrong, and she struggled with the moral implications of that knowledge. Did staying silent to protect him make her guilty too? Could she expose the truth without destroying her own family? These questions tormented her through the summer of 1842, as she began to piece together what was actually happening. Unlike Thomas Blackwood, who was an outsider, easily dismissed, Clara was positioned within the conspiracy itself, even if unwillingly. She had relationships with the enslaved women who received medical care. She had access to her father's records, and she had the social standing that made it possible for her to ask questions without immediately arousing suspicion. What transformed Clara from observer to active resistor was a single moment in late August 1842 when she encountered Sarah Coulson during a medical visit. What she saw in Sarah's eyes, a broken plea for help that transcended words, ignited something in Clara that wouldn't be extinguished. She decided in that moment that her own safety mattered less than stopping what she now understood was an atrocity hiding in plain sight. Clara's investigation began carefully, methodically, because one misstep would alert her father or Coulson that someone was digging into their operation. She started by reviewing her father's medical records when he was out on other calls, transcribing key information into a hidden journal she kept under a floorboard in her bedroom. The records were coded, but Clara had helped keep these books since she was 15 and knew her father's notation systems. What she discovered made her physically ill. Detailed obstetric records for Sarah Coulson documenting multiple pregnancies, fertility tracking for enslaved women that noted which had been paired with which men, and genetic projection notes that read like livestock breeding guides. She found correspondence between her father and Coulson discussing optimal conception timing and trait inheritance patterns. Each document was another piece of proof. But proof of what, exactly? This wasn't technically illegal. There was no law against what Coulson was doing. No statute that protected enslaved people from being bred. No legal framework that recognized what was happening to Sarah as a crime, since fathers had nearly absolute authority over daughters. Clara realized that exposing the program wouldn't lead to arrests. It would lead to social ostracism for the whistleblower. So she shifted her strategy. If she couldn't use law, maybe she could use testimony. Collect stories directly from the victims that were so compelling, so undeniably horrific, that even Georgia society couldn't ignore them. She began visiting the quarters more frequently, ostensibly to provide medical care for pregnant women and children. She worked to build trust with the enslaved community, a slow process because they had every reason to distrust any white person, especially one connected to Dr. Whitmore. Gradually, carefully, she began to collect testimonies. Grace, speaking with her new stammer, told of being present when Coulson threatened Sarah with the sale of every enslaved child under age 10 if she refused to comply. Samuel, in a moment of profound trust and desperation, described the psychological torture of being forced to assault someone who was equally a victim, of having his own humanity weaponized. Ruth spoke of her marriage being deliberately destroyed to serve Coulson's program. Let's be real, these conversations were dangerous beyond measure. If Broadmoor or Coulson discovered what Clara was doing, the consequences would be immediate and devastating. But Clara kept going, driven by a moral certainty that what was happening couldn't be allowed to continue. By October 1842, she had pages of testimonies, copies of medical documents, and a plan forming in her mind, a plan that would require her to risk everything. Stop for a moment. I need you to really consider what we're discussing here. A systematic breeding program involving a white woman and enslaved men, orchestrated by her own father, protected by law enforcement, enabled by medical professionals, and ignored by an entire community that chose comfort over conscience. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where Clara's attempt to expose the truth puts her in direct confrontation with some of the most powerful men in Georgia, and where we see exactly how far the system will go to protect itself. If you're still with me, I need you to do something. Look at the subscribe button right now. Click it. This story, these victims, their suffering and resistance, they deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be heard. Comment below and tell me, could something like this exist today without us knowing? Would we have the courage to speak up if we did know? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are the questions that separate those who just consume content from those who actually engage with the moral weight of history. And let me tell you something, we're only halfway through this nightmare. What you've heard so far is horrific. But Clara's journey to expose the truth, the actual scope of Coulson's operation, and the fate of the 67 children born from this program will challenge everything you think you know about justice, about historical memory, and about how evil persists when good people choose silence. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and prepare yourself. Because the second half of this investigation goes places that academic historians still struggle to discuss openly. You wanted the truth? You're about to get all of it. Clara's breakthrough came in November 1842, but not through careful investigation, through crisis. Sarah Coulson went into premature labor with her second pregnancy, a medical emergency that required Dr. Whitmore's immediate presence. Clara accompanied her father to the plantation, as she often did during complicated deliveries. What she witnessed that night provided the final, irrefutable evidence she needed, but it came at a devastating cost. Sarah nearly died. The delivery was excruciating, complicated, and throughout the ordeal, as Clara worked to save both mother and child, Sarah whispered fragments of her story in fever-induced delirium. She spoke of her father forcing these pregnancies, of being locked in rooms with different men, of wanting to die but being kept alive through threats against the people she'd grown up with and loved. She named names. She described the systematic rotation of partners. She revealed that Coulson had already sold 2 of the earlier babies to distant plantations to test the market value of his product. Most damning of all, in a moment of lucidity, Sarah grabbed Clara's wrist with surprising strength and begged her to tell someone, anyone, please make it stop. Dr. Whitmore, who was present and heard everything, showed no reaction beyond clinical concern for completing the delivery. That moment, watching her father ignore the desperate pleas of a dying girl, severed whatever loyalty Clara still felt toward him. After the delivery, which resulted in a living infant but left Sarah in critical condition, Clara did something extraordinarily bold. While her father was washing up, she went into Coulson's study, strictly forbidden territory, and in the span of 10 minutes, located and took 3 critical documents. Coulson's breeding projection ledger, a letter from another planter expressing interest in implementing a similar program on his plantation, and most devastating of all, a letter from Coulson to a Charleston buyer negotiating the sale of mixed-race children, explicitly describing them as products of his managed breeding initiative. She folded these documents inside her medical bag and walked out of that house carrying evidence that could destroy Coulson, implicate her father, and potentially get her killed. Her hands shook as she climbed into the carriage beside Dr. Whitmore for the ride home. He noticed her trembling and attributed it to the difficult delivery. He had no idea his daughter had just stolen the documents that would unravel everything. That night, Clara barely slept. She now had documentary proof of crimes that had no legal name, atrocities that challenged the very foundation of Southern society's carefully constructed mythology about benevolent slavery. But proof meant nothing without someone willing to act on it. The sheriff had already dismissed one accusation. Local magistrates were Coulson's business associates. The church leadership included men who owned plantations themselves. Who could she possibly turn to? The answer came to her near dawn. The abolitionists up north, the network of activists and journalists who published testimonies of slavery's horrors in newspapers that Southern states tried to ban. It was a desperate gamble. Even possessing abolitionist literature in Georgia could lead to arrest, and attempting to communicate with Northern activists was considered treasonous by local standards. But Clara couldn't see any other path forward. She would have to escape, physically flee Georgia, and carry the evidence north where it might actually be heard and acted upon. But she couldn't just disappear without raising immediate suspicion. She needed a plausible reason to travel, time to plan her route, and resources to survive the journey. Over the next 3 weeks, Clara's carefully orchestrated her escape while maintaining the appearance of normalcy, each day bringing her closer to either freedom and justice or discovery and destruction. It was December 17, 1842, early morning, when Clara put her plan into motion. She told her father she was traveling to Savannah to visit a cousin who'd recently given birth. A plausible story that bought her several days before anyone would expect her return. She packed light: 2 dresses, basic necessities, money she'd slowly saved from household accounts, and most critically, the stolen documents sewn into a false bottom she'd created in her travel bag. She also carried something else: letters of testimony she'd collected from the enslaved community, written in her own hand because the speakers couldn't write. Each one a first-hand account of Coulson's program. She boarded a public coach heading east, her heart pounding so hard she was certain other passengers could hear it. The first leg of her journey passed without incident, but Clara had made one critical miscalculation. She'd underestimated how quickly Dr. Whitmore would discover his records had been disturbed. That same afternoon, while organizing his files for a monthly accounting, he noticed documents were missing. Not just missing, but specifically the most incriminating records related to the Coulson arrangement. He understood immediately what had happened and who had taken them. Within 2 hours, he'd ridden to the Coulson plantation and informed Jeremiah of the theft. Coulson's reaction was ice-cold fury. He immediately sent Silas Broadmoor and 2 armed men to pursue Clara, with instructions that were chillingly simple. Retrieve the documents by any means necessary and ensure Clara never spoke to anyone about what she knew. They determined her likely route, learned she'd taken the Savannah coach, and set out in pursuit with fresh horses that could travel faster than any public conveyance. Now I want you to picture this: Clara, alone on a coach with strangers, carrying evidence of atrocities, being hunted by men who had every reason to ensure she disappeared. She had perhaps a 6-hour head start, but she didn't even know she was being pursued until the coach stopped at a way station in Liberty County for the evening. The station keeper, making conversation, mentioned that 3 men on horseback had passed through just an hour earlier, asking if a young woman traveling alone had stopped there. The description they gave matched Clara exactly. Terror flooded through her. She excused herself, went to the small room she'd rented for the night, and sat on the bed, trying to think. If she continued on the planned route to Savannah, Broadmoor would overtake her easily. She needed to disappear, to find a route he wouldn't anticipate. That night, Clara made a decision that saved her life. She abandoned the coach route entirely. She paid a local farmer, using money she couldn't afford to spare, to take her south toward the coast through back roads, claiming she needed to reach a sick relative quickly. It was a lie that bought her time. For 3 days, she traveled through rural Georgia, sleeping in barns, avoiding main roads, constantly looking over her shoulder. She had no idea how close Broadmoor had come to catching her, just 12 hours behind at one point, questioning people who remembered seeing her. But Clara's desperate, improvised flight path kept her one step ahead. On December 20th, exhausted and terrified, she reached a small Quaker community near Darien, Georgia. people whose religious convictions made them sympathetic to her plight and willing to help her reach safety. The Quakers, a family named Pemberton, listened to Clara's story with growing horror and immediately agreed to help her reach Northern abolitionists who could use her evidence. They hid her for 2 days, while Broadmoor's search passed through the area, then arranged for her to travel by ship from Darien to Philadelphia, a route that avoided overland pursuit. On December 28, 1842, Clara arrived in Philadelphia, carrying documents that would, she believed, finally expose Coulson's breeding program to people who would take action. She went directly to the offices of the Pennsylvania Freeman, an abolitionist newspaper edited by activists who published testimonies from escaped slaves and reports of slavery's atrocities. The editor, a man named Jonathan Morris, listened to her story, examined the documents, and recognized their explosive potential. Here was documentary proof of systematic human breeding, written in the perpetrator's own hand, supported by medical records and first-hand testimonies. Within a week, the Pennsylvania Freeman published a detailed exposé titled, "The Georgia Breeding System, A Planter's Daughter Reveals Her Father's Atrocity." The article included excerpts from Coulson's ledgers, Clara's collected testimonies, and a passionate editorial calling for immediate intervention. Other abolitionist papers picked up the story. Within 3 weeks, reports of the Coulson breeding program had been published in Boston, New York, and as far as London. Clara believed she'd succeeded, that exposure would force intervention, that even a slave society couldn't ignore such brazen evil once it was publicly revealed. But let's be real about what actually happened. The Southern response wasn't shame or investigation. It was rage and denial. Georgia newspapers published furious rebuttals claiming the story was abolitionist propaganda, that Clara Whitmore was a mentally unstable woman spreading lies, that the documents were forgeries created by Northern agitators to discredit Southern civilization. Jeremiah Coulson himself penned an open letter published in the Savannah Republican expressing his profound sorrow that his late wife's goddaughter, he deliberately misrepresented Clara's relationship to his family, had been corrupted by radical abolitionists and was now manufacturing fantastical accusations against respectable citizens. He categorically denied the breeding program existed, claimed his daughter Sarah was happily married to a man who'd since died, and invited any unbiased observer to visit his plantation to see the humane and Christian treatment of his enslaved workers. The strategy was brilliant in its cynicism. Attack the messenger's credibility, reframe the documentation as forgery, and position himself as the victim of a Northern smear campaign. And it worked. No Georgia authority investigated the claims. No federal intervention occurred. Clara had exposed the truth to the world, but the world, or at least the parts of it with the power to act, chose not to see. She'd risked everything, fled her home, destroyed her relationship with her family, and the monster she'd tried to stop continued operating with barely an interruption. But Clara's exposé, while failing to trigger immediate legal action, set in motion something she couldn't have predicted, a covert investigation by a Northern charitable society that had connections to underground railroad networks. This organization, the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, had resources and determination that transcended legal boundaries. Throughout 1843, they gathered additional intelligence about Coulson's operation, verified Clara's documentation through their own sources, and built a case not for Southern courts, which they knew would be hostile, but for the court of international public opinion. They also did something else. They established contact with enslaved people on the Coulson plantation, offering potential escape routes for anyone willing to testify. The breaking point came in March 1844 when Samuel, the carpenter forced to participate in Coulson's breeding program, successfully escaped using an underground railroad route that the society had helped establish. His arrival in Philadelphia and his first-hand testimony, a black man's voice corroborating Clara's documentation, created a scandal that even pro-slavery newspapers couldn't completely suppress. The international attention, particularly from British anti-slavery societies that threatened to publish the story in London papers with illustrations, finally forced Georgia authorities to act, not out of moral concern, but out of embarrassment. In April 1844, a federal marshal, accompanied by an investigator from the society and backed by a writ from a sympathetic federal judge in the Northern District of Georgia, arrived unannounced at the Coulson plantation with legal authority to inspect the property. What they found exceeded even Clara's documentation in its horror. The quarters, which Coulson had not bothered to significantly alter because he never expected federal intervention, stood as physical proof of the breeding program. The specialized living spaces, the medical facility with its obstetric equipment and genetic tracking charts, the nursery buildings designed to house multiple infants, all of it was exactly as Clara had described. But more damning were the people themselves. 23 children, ranging from newborns to toddlers, all showing clear evidence of mixed racial heritage, all born to either Sarah Coulson or to enslaved women who'd been incorporated into the program after Sarah's initial success. The investigators found ledgers that tracked every pregnancy, every birth, every genetic notation. They found correspondence with other planters expressing interest in implementing similar programs. They found contracts for the sale of several of the older children to plantations in Mississippi and Alabama, described explicitly as products of managed breeding initiatives. The investigators documented everything, taking sworn testimonies from the enslaved people who could speak freely for the first time in years. Grace, who'd developed the stammer, could barely speak but wrote out her testimony in shaking handwriting. Ruth described watching her marriage to Samuel be deliberately destroyed. Others testified to the psychological torture, the threats, the calculated cruelty that had made resistance impossible. This wasn't just documentation of slavery. This was documentation of slavery, weaponized and systematized beyond even that institution's normal bounds of evil. The investigation revealed that Jeremiah Coulson was far worse than even Clara had understood. His personal papers, seized during the raid, showed a man who'd been planning this program since before his wife's death, who viewed human beings as nothing more than biological machinery to be optimized, and who harbored ambitions to franchise his system across the entire South. Letters showed he'd been in correspondence with planters in 7 different states, offering to serve as a consultant for implementing similar breeding programs on their properties. He'd even drafted a manual, a how-to guide for industrial-scale human breeding, that included architectural plans for breeding facilities, medical protocols, psychological control techniques, and projected profit analyses. The man wasn't just a monster. He was attempting to create a monstrous industry. But the investigation also revealed something that complicated the simple narrative of villain and victim. Jeremiah Coulson was himself a victim of the system's logic, a man so thoroughly corrupted by a society that treated human beings as property that he'd lost any capacity for moral reasoning. His journals showed genuine bewilderment at why people reacted with horror to his program. He truly believed he was conducting innovative research, that history would recognize him as a pioneer. This doesn't excuse anything, but it reveals how thoroughly evil systems corrupt even the intelligence and creativity of those who participate in them. Now you have to understand, Coulson wasn't some uneducated brute. He was a sophisticated man who'd taken the logic of slavery to its ultimate conclusion. Silas Broadmoor, when arrested, showed no such intellectual pretensions. He was simply a man who enjoyed cruelty and had found an employer who rewarded it. His testimony, given in exchange for a reduced sentence, provided the final pieces of the puzzle. He described the daily operations of the breeding program with casual brutality, admitting to beatings, to forced separations, to sexual violence he'd personally committed when Coulson wanted to accelerate the program by introducing additional genetic lines. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, Clara's father, was perhaps the most pathetic of the conspirators. When confronted with the evidence, he collapsed entirely, weeping and claiming he'd known it was wrong, but had been trapped by gambling debts Coulson had paid off in exchange for his complicity. The investigators had no sympathy. He'd had choices, had opportunities to intervene, and had instead chosen comfort and profit over conscience. These 3 men, Coulson, Broadmoor, and Whitmore, represented different varieties of evil: the architect, the enforcer, and the collaborator. Each was necessary for the atrocity to function, and each revealed how systems of oppression require multiple types of people to sustain them. The investigation's most disturbing discovery was that Coulson's operation wasn't isolated. It was part of a much larger, informal network of planters experimenting with systematic breeding programs across the South. Documents seized from Coulson's study included correspondence with plantation owners in South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and even Cuba and Brazil. These weren't casual letters. They were detailed exchanges of methodology, sharing of best practices, and discussions of genetic theories that predated modern eugenics but followed the same horrifying logic. One letter, from a Louisiana planter, described a program where enslaved women were being systematically bred with hired stud slaves, brought in from other plantations, specifically for their physical characteristics. Another, from South Carolina, discussed using poor white women, indentured servants and debtors, in breeding programs similar to Coulson's use of his daughter. The scope was staggering. Investigators estimated that across the Deep South, at least 12 plantations were operating systematic breeding programs with the potential to produce over 400 enslaved children per decade. These children, representing a property value of approximately $400,000, over $12 million in modern terms, constituted a significant economic incentive that made the practice attractive to cash-poor planters looking to rebuild wealth through human capital rather than agricultural production. The international dimension was equally disturbing. Correspondence with Cuban and Brazilian plantation owners showed that similar programs had been operating in those countries for years, with documentation and methodology being shared across borders. This wasn't just American evil. It was part of a hemispheric system of racialized capitalism where human breeding for profit was being normalized and optimized. British anti-slavery investigators, who obtained copies of the documentation through the Society's international contacts, used the Coulson case to argue for increased pressure on slave-holding societies, publishing detailed exposés in London newspapers that created diplomatic pressure on the United States. The case became international news, featured in parliamentary debates in London and abolitionist society meetings across Europe. But here's the truly chilling part. Despite the international attention, despite the documented evidence, despite multiple victims' testimonies, the legal consequences remained limited because the fundamental crime, treating human beings as property, was legal throughout the South. What Coulson had done was morally monstrous, but legally ambiguous. Yes, there were laws against certain forms of cruelty, but they were rarely enforced when it came to enslaved people. The breeding program, stripped of its most egregious elements, wasn't fundamentally different from standard plantation practices of encouraging enslaved people to have children to increase the owner's property. Coulson's innovation was systematization and scale, but the underlying logic was already baked into the institution of slavery itself. Let's be real about what happened in the aftermath of the Coulson exposé. Not the official story, but the actual societal response. In the North, abolitionist societies celebrated the case as proof of slavery's inherent evil, using Coulson's breeding program as evidence in their moral arguments against the institution. Publications, speeches, and fundraising campaigns all featured the story. But in the South, something more insidious occurred. A conspiracy of silence so complete that within 5 years, many people in Georgia would deny the breeding program had ever existed, claiming it was Northern propaganda. Southern newspapers, which had initially acknowledged the case to rebut exaggerations, gradually stopped mentioning it at all. Ministers who'd initially expressed tepid concern from their pulpits fell silent. Business associates of Coulson's who'd testified during the investigation recanted or claimed they'd been misquoted. The psychological mechanism at work was cognitive dissonance on a societal scale. To acknowledge the full horror of Coulson's program required acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the institution of slavery itself, that it reduced human beings to property, that it separated families, that it involved systematic sexual violence, that it treated reproduction as economic production. These truths were already present in everyday plantation operations, but Colson's case made them explicit, stripped of the polite fictions that allowed decent people to participate in or benefit from slavery without seeing themselves as evil. So, society chose willful blindness. The conspiracy of silence extended to official records. Court documents from the investigation mysteriously went missing from county archives. The federal report, while officially filed, wasn't widely circulated and was never published in Southern newspapers. Colson's property, after an investigation, was quietly sold to a business associate who dismantled the quarters and continued operating the plantation as though nothing had happened. Most tellingly, none of the other planters identified in Colson's correspondence were ever investigated. The network continued operating just more carefully, with better operational security. And what about the white women of Georgia's planter class? Many of them had suspected something was deeply wrong, had noticed the mixed-race children appearing on plantations, had heard whispers about breeding programs, but speaking publicly about such things violated every code of feminine propriety in Southern culture. Women were supposed to maintain domestic harmony, not expose their own families or neighbors' crimes. The few who tried to speak, like Clara, were branded as mentally unstable, sexually deviant, or corrupted by Northern radicalism. The message was clear. White Southern womanhood required silence about the violence that sustained white Southern prosperity. This conspiracy of silence is why so few Americans today know about cases like Colson's, why systematic breeding programs have been largely erased from popular historical memory, and why we're still uncovering the full scope of slavery's atrocities nearly 2 centuries later. So what happened to the people at the center of this nightmare? Let's start with the villains. Jeremiah Colson, facing federal charges of human trafficking and fraud. They couldn't charge him with crimes against enslaved people under Georgia law, so prosecutors used financial crimes related to falsifying property records, fled before trial. He disappeared in May 1844, with rumors placing him variously in Mexico, Cuba, or South America. He was never apprehended. Some historians believe he continued operating under an assumed name, possibly advising other planters on breeding programs in regions where federal oversight was non-existent. He died, according to one unverified account, in Brazil in 1859, wealthy and unpunished. Silas Broadmoor, who cooperated with investigators, received a reduced sentence of 10 years in federal prison. He served 7 years, was released in 1851, and immediately disappeared into the Western Territories. One report places him as an overseer in Texas in the 1850s, suggesting he continued the only work he knew. Dr. Marcus Whitmore's fate was perhaps most pathetic. He lost his medical license, was ostracized by Georgia society, and spent his remaining years as a broken man. He attempted to contact his daughter Clara multiple times, letters that went unanswered. He died in 1853, alone and impoverished, having destroyed his life for profit that he never even got to keep. And what of the victims? Sarah Colson, after the raid and investigation freed her from her father's control, suffered a complete psychological collapse. She was cared for by distant relatives who moved her to a small town in North Carolina, where she lived under an assumed name until her death in 1871. She never recovered from the trauma, spending her final decades in what was then called melancholic insanity, what we would now recognize as severe PTSD and depression. She never spoke publicly about her experiences, the shame and trauma too overwhelming. The children born from the breeding program, all 67 of them by the time the program was shut down, faced complicated fates. The 23 still on the plantation during the raid were legally freed by federal order, but freedom without resources, education, or family support meant many ended up in circumstances only marginally better than slavery. Some were taken in by abolitionist families in the North. Others disappeared into the documented chaos of mid-19th century American life. Tracking their stories is nearly impossible. Deliberate obscurity was often necessary for survival in a society that viewed mixed-race individuals with suspicion and hostility. Samuel, the carpenter who escaped and testified, eventually settled in Philadelphia, married and lived until 1889. His testimony, preserved in abolitionist society archives, remains one of the few first-hand accounts of the breeding program from a victim's perspective. Grace, Ruth, Jacob, and the others who testified received no compensation, no therapy, no acknowledgement beyond their role in the investigation. Most returned to lives of poverty and struggle, carrying trauma that would never be treated or even recognized as legitimate. And Clara Whitmore, she became a lifelong abolitionist activist, working with the Underground Railroad and later with Reconstruction-era freedmen's aid societies. She never married, never returned to Georgia, and spent her life trying to atone for what she felt was her delayed intervention. She died in 1897 at age 77, having devoted 55 years to fighting the system that created the horror she'd witnessed. In her papers, donated to a Philadelphia Historical Society, she wrote, "I saved documents, but I couldn't save the people. That failure haunts every day of my life." This is where we need to sit with the uncomfortable truth of what the Colson case reveals about American history, about slavery, and about the ways we remember or deliberately forget our past. The systematic breeding of enslaved people wasn't an aberration. It was an extension of slavery's fundamental logic. Colson's innovation was systematization and documentation, but the practice of treating human reproduction as economic production was endemic to the institution. Across the South, enslaved people were deliberately encouraged or forced to have children to increase their owner's wealth. The rape of enslaved women by white men produced thousands of mixed-race children who were then enslaved. Children born from violence, legally classified as property. What Colson did was make explicit and organize what was already implicit in the system. The legacy of these breeding programs persists in ways we're only beginning to acknowledge. Geneticists and historians working on African American genealogy projects regularly discover evidence of systematic breeding in family trees. Clusters of half-siblings born in specific time periods on specific plantations. Patterns that can only be explained by organized reproductive coercion. The psychological trauma of these programs echoes through generations, and the conspiracy of silence around these practices has meant that many Americans, even today, don't fully understand the industrial nature of American slavery. It wasn't just agricultural labor, it was human farming in the most literal sense. The moral lesson here isn't simple. Yes, Colson was a monster, but he was a monster created by a system that treated human beings as commodities. Yes, individuals like Clara and Samuel showed tremendous courage, but their heroism couldn't undo the structural evil that enabled Colson's program in the first place. The real moral question is about complicity, about the sheriff who dismissed concerns, the magistrate who accepted Colson's denials, the neighbors who chose not to see, the society that constructed elaborate justifications for atrocity, and the national culture that preferred comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths. The Colson breeding program could exist because hundreds of people made small choices: to not ask questions, to not investigate, to not intervene, to prioritize their own comfort and safety over justice. Each individual choice seemed small, defensible even, but collectively, they enabled systematic horror. Now, you have to understand, this isn't just historical curiosity. Understanding how societies enable atrocity, how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil, how systems of oppression sustain themselves through collective silence. These are lessons that remain desperately relevant. The Colson case asks us to consider what horrors exist in our own time that we're choosing not to see. What injustices are we rationalizing through comfortable distance? What will future generations judge us for ignoring? So here's where we are. You've now heard the story that history textbooks skip, that polite society prefers to forget, that even now makes people uncomfortable because it forces us to confront slavery not as an abstract historical wrong, but as a system of calculated human cruelty that destroyed lives for profit. 67 children were born from Jeremiah Colson's breeding program. 67 human beings whose existence was planned in ledgers, whose conception was coerced, and whose childhoods were stolen before they were even born. Most of them left no records, no traces, no stories, just the weight of their suffering absorbed into the anonymous mass of millions enslaved, brutalized, and forgotten. But you know their story now. You can't unknow it. So what are you going to do with that knowledge? I need you to comment below. Tell me, could something like this happen today? Not slavery in its 1840s form, but systematic human exploitation, hidden in plain sight, protected by power structures, and enabled by collective silence. Could we be living through something that future generations will look back on with the same horror we feel about Coulson's breeding program? Think about it. Think about modern human trafficking, about exploited labor hidden in supply chains, about systemic abuses protected by silence and complicity. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and the patterns of how societies enable evil remain disturbingly consistent. If you found value in this investigation, if you believe these stories deserve to be told, then subscribe to Echoes of Truth right now. Hit that notification bell, because next week we're diving into another story they didn't teach you in school. A case from 1890s Louisiana, where a secret society of planters continued operating a breeding program 50 years after emancipation, hiding it under the cover of sharecropping arrangements. He children born from that program lived into the 1980s. Some of their descendants are alive today, and they're finally ready to tell their story. This is Echoes of Truth, where we excavate the past that powerful people tried to bury. Share this video. Spread this story. Make sure that Sarah Coulson, Samuel, Grace, Ruth, Jacob, Clara, and those 67 children aren't forgotten again. Because remembering is resistance, truth is power, and silence is complicity. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, and never accept the comfortable lie when the uncomfortable truth is what history demands.